Good morning, everyone. We are the 8th of March, and I'm so pleased to have you here with our very first Saturday session at 3LM. And it's rearing chickens for meat within a regenerative system. And it's with Alison and Dave Carpenter of the Sailean project in Scotland. They've got a lot to tell you, so I'm going to turn it right over to you, Alison and Dave. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Sheila, and thanks for having us, and thank you everyone for joining us. So just to make sure you're all in the right place, we're going to be giving, as brief as we possibly can, an overview of the component parts of our chicken enterprise and how we've applied the principles to our unique setting, and including how we integrate our chicken enterprise into our existing grazing challenge system. Along the way, we'll cover some of the challenges we've come across within our system and other factors that you might want to consider if you were thinking about setting up a chicken enterprise yourself, which might influence the viability for you, whether that's economic or otherwise. I'm at pains to state we are in Scotland, so we're obviously thinking about UK and specifically Scottish legislation and regulation, so we haven't researched requirements in other parts of the world. So you might have to do a little bit of homework if that's something you're interested in thinking about for your location. We have got some time for questions later, but I know that if things crop up that are relevant to a specific slide, I think Sheila's going to interrupt us and we'll try and cover things if it's pertinent to that slide.
Cool. So this is where we are. So we're in the middle of Loch Linney, on the kind of west coast of Scotland. Lismore's a limestone island of population of approximately 160 people, and we're very lucky to live on this little chunk of the island just here. The general landscape is a real mix. Lots of kind of deep bogs, lots of exposed rock. The steeper ground we're kind of letting regenerate to naturalized woodland. There's kind of old kind of limestone quarries at the back, but also some lovely pasture as well.
So just a little bit about ourselves, who are we, and the Sailean project in general. That's us, and that's Dobby the chicken in the middle. So who are we? Dave has a background in horticulture and outdoor education, and he's an all-round, very practical, hands-on person. Great problem solver. I have a master's degree in animal behaviour and welfare and an eye for detail. We both run our own businesses and worked for larger organisations, and we previously lived on a small holding in Cumbria while we both worked full-time. So we've got quite a few things, quite a few transferable skills that we bring to farming. The Sailean project was established a few years ago by Roger and Gilly Dixon Spain. So it's their vision that we're kind of taking forward. And at that point, it was with a view to testing out whether this kind of idea about new grazing practices, different grazing practices, really could restore and maintain soil health, whilst positively influencing the water cycle, improving biodiversity, and so on. Particularly as the land on Lismore is classified as less favourable and severely disadvantaged. I know a lot of people are interested in the change in legislation around the poultry sector. We can't take any credit for that, I'm afraid. It was before our time, but Roger and Gilly campaigned for a change in the legislation. So, Dave, can you just briefly cover that?
Yeah, somewhere with the devolution of the Scottish kind of setup from the main UK one, there had become a kind of closed loop on the access to the poultry industry, whereas one of your requirements for the welfare at time of killing had somehow become you already needed to be part of the poultry industry. which you'd think would be a relatively simple, whoops, that didn't mean to happen, let's get that changed. But it actually took multiple years. And I think in the end, they actually got it changed on an anti-competition kind of side. So as I say, yeah, should have been relatively quick and simple, but was a multi-year and very involved process.
And I'm sure if people want to know more about the specific detail about how that happened, we can find out for you. Gilly, I'm sure will happily share that information. We arrived on the island in January 2020, just before the lovely COVID pandemic. So we've survived a pandemic and a house build since our arrival here. And we took over the reins of the Salon project full-time approximately 2 years ago. In theory, Roger keeps telling us he's retired, but I think he's going to keep going for a little while yet. So we also have since taken on a lease for the croft. So we're kind of running the day-to-day practical side of the croft. And the next phase of the Salon project is, okay, we've seen some lovely progress with the development of the land and the soil health and so on, but can we actually make a small-scale regenerative farm financially viable? So that's kind of part of the next phase of the project for us. We manage here approximately 31.5 hectares. That's about 78 acres in old money. And the land, as you've seen from the photographs, is predominantly craggy hillside with a few nice bits in the bottom. And we can have between 2 and 3 meters of rain annually. So we have quite a lot of water to manage as well. We graze 10 Highland cattle and 10 sheep outdoors year round, and we aim to produce between 300 and 400 chickens in a year at the moment. That's the scale we're kind of working on. I think we produced 350 birds last year. All of our meat sales are direct to the customer.
Cool. So this is just a kind of more of an overview of the croft itself. We're running somewhere in the region of 70 virtual paddocks. The rest of the croft goes over to different kind of habitat areas and also the deferred grazing for the winter. So, oops, I've got some, yeah, so this area up here gets left for the winter grazing, and the animals then get moved at various points through the other ones, anywhere between a day and 3 days per area, depending on the productivity of those areas. Now, what's actually accessible to the chickens is this area here. So just under kind of 2 hectares. And that's driven by, we need it to be relatively flat for the system to work, to actually get the shelters in there, to be able to access, to take feed in and out, and to actually set the nets without it becoming too much of a kind of a chore and an issue.
Okay, so why the chicken enterprise at all? Because let's be honest, let's consider for a moment, rearing on pasture means it takes longer to get the product to market, to get the birds to their chosen weight. It involves an increased cost of feed, and an additional predator risk with the birds being outdoors. So that's why the big sheds full of chickens exist, because it's cheaper. So we've got to consider that there are other benefits to pastured chicken that outweigh all of those things, right? So firstly, we think about the benefit to the pasture, not least natural fertilization. Now, obviously, we are bringing external nutrients onto the site, but in the form of feed, which is then processed by the chickens and redistributed onto the soil. And of course, we get a chicken out of the bargain too. This process also contributes to increased forage for the ruminants, so it's benefiting the cattle and the sheep later down the line too, because we get increased forage as a result of this fertilization. And also pest management. I mean, that's one of the classic things, is that the chickens eat the larvae and in the cowpats and so on, and manage, we get a more natural balance for pests on site because of the chickens. And of course, it means we're not using harmful pesticides, which is also something that we kind of is important to us. The benefit to the chickens themselves from a welfare point of view is that's a really important part of our holistic context is animal welfare. So our chickens have an increased opportunity to engage in those natural innate behaviours of pecking, foraging, rummaging around on the ground, which they would naturally spend 80% of their time budget engaged in those kind of activities. So they've got much more opportunity to do that. It's very rare to see issues like feather pecking within our outdoor reared flocks because the chickens get an opportunity to carry out those kind of hardwired behaviours naturally without feeling the need to just do it to the closest possible thing, which is the chicken sitting on the perch next door. We know that stress leads all animals to perform those kind of innate behaviours in unnatural situations, out of context to the situation. The consideration about the economic benefits of a chicken program, the speed of the conversion of the product. I mean, let's be honest, we can produce a chicken within several weeks compared to some of our larger livestock that's taken us years to produce. It's possible to scale up or down as a result of that speed within a single season, depending on the market and the customer needs. Although there's obviously some necessary infrastructure which influences the bottom line. But the cost of stock itself is obviously much cheaper than larger livestock. For us, there was an additional benefit that we've already got existing infrastructure on site that we were able to use across all the enterprises. So things like our walk-in freezer, our marketing platform, and so on were already in existence. So we're kind of able to share that cost across more than the one enterprise. From a kind of wider environmental point of view, we consider, low food miles. That's also something to consider about. Unfortunately, the distance that our chicks travel to begin with is a bit further than we'd like at the moment. But once they're here, they're literally traveling meters. And then our market for delivery is within the county, so within a kind of 30-kilometre radius. So food miles much smaller than they might be elsewhere. Timeframes, we have obviously quite a short summer season compared to other places, but we at a push can get 3 batches of chickens reared and into the freezer in our short summer season. So for us, it's a kind of a product that's possible in our very short kind of summertime. And also, really importantly, the benefit to humans. We're providing a nutritious source of protein for ourselves and our customers. Pasture-raised meat has been shown to be more nutrient dense. And of course, we're not using chemicals, we're not using growth hormones. And the feedback we get most commonly from people is, it tastes like chicken, it tastes like I remember chicken tasting. And, soil health and, animal welfare and all of that stuff is great. But if the chickens tasted rubbish, the customers wouldn't come back. So that's kind of a really important factor for us. So very quickly, thinking about the stages of rearing and the time frame of these things. So we get our chicks as day-old chicks. They're brooding indoors for 3 to 4 weeks, depending on weather conditions and so on, until they're kind of feathered up enough to go outside. Once they move out onto the pasture, we're then kind of monitoring for them reaching the target weight, and that can take somewhere between 7 and 8 weeks, depending on what we choose our target weight to be. So we've kind of got a 12-week process from arriving on the farm to processing. Between the team of 4 of us, we're very lucky to have some free labour that help out. So between 4 of us, we average about 75 birds in a day. So if we've got a batch of 150, say, we'd do that over a couple of days. And then, of course, the next step is the critical one from a financial point, which is getting the product to market. Who can resist a cute picture of a chick? So we, as I said earlier, we buy our stock as day olds. We're a bit restricted on choice due to our geography and the potential travel time for chicks. We would like that to be less than it really is. From the hatchery, it's always a really mad scramble getting to the meeting point, which is the service station in Stirling, and we've usually got like a half-hour window, and then we've got to get the chicks back before the next ferry. So always a bit of a mad scramble. Choice of breed has been something that we've kind of considered quite a lot, and we tried different breeds. We've experimented. Some of the meat breeds, such as the Ross Cobbs, basically been selectively bred to be eating machines, and we found that those birds, we were getting birds with heart failure or birds that were too heavy to move on their under exercised legs. They just sit in the feed troughs and eat. And from an animal welfare point of view, that was something we didn't want to encourage, and we didn't want to buy in. We want to raise birds that get to live a more chickeny life, really, and not just eat themselves to death. So we have tried other breeds to kind of help us out with that value. It just doesn't work for us to have birds that are living in those kind of conditions. So breeds that we've liked that align to our values, the Sassos, and then last year we raised Hubbards, and they were really nice birds as well. So as I say, there may be more options elsewhere, but we're kind of a little bit restricted on options because of our geography. So yeah, everybody's always really interested in the mobile shelters and the kind of outdoor side of things. But we've got to consider that when the birds come to us, they can't manage their own heat, and they've got no feathers. So we've got this. I'm going to make this up as we go along. Can I borrow yours? Oh, thank you. No, that's not good. So what we need here is indoor. Obviously, we're pretty cold and drafty, breezy place in Scotland on an island. So we need an indoor space that is draft free. We try and keep wild birds out and try and be predator free. We don't have a problem with rats on Lismore, fortunately. But in the past in England, we've certainly lost chicks to rats in the brooder. So just thinking about other risks. They need to be under heat for up to 3 weeks. Basically, we gradually raise the lamps to kind of reduce the temperature until they are feathered and able to sort of be robust enough to deal with the ambient temperature, particularly at night time, before we would think about moving them outdoors. So that it's 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the speed of feathering up and so on. And things like the external temperature, if it's really wild and still very cold, we might choose to keep them indoors a little bit longer. It's a good idea to kind of have your drinkers in a position where that you can gradually raise those, because obviously as the chickens are scratching around, we want to keep the water as clean as we can. There's always one chick that thinks it's a duckling and wants to sit in the drinkers as well. So we gradually raise the drinkers as the birds grow too. We feed ad lib for the first 3 days or so chick crumb just available to them all day to begin with, and then we move on to a system of weighing out and feeding rations 5 times a day to start with. So that gives us lots of opportunities throughout the day to check on the chicks, make observations. Are they hot? Are they cold? Are they, how are they behaving? Is the one that's behaving differently to the others? Are they clearing all the feed in between times? Those kind of things. And we keep records of all of that. What's the temperature doing outside? That kind of thing. We also weigh the chicks daily while they're brooding. There's always one that's kind of got distinguishing features or marks that we use as our kind of control bird. And that one gets weighed every day. And then we'll choose a couple of others just to kind of compare against that control. And we're just seeing that the birds are kind of growing in a uniform way and that everything's moving in the right direction.
It's actually one of the most kind of labor intensive parts of the process, because you're looking at kind of 5 or 6 visits during the daylight period. Now we both work off site as well, so we need to kind of timetable that there's at least one of us around to carry that out. So yes, something else to consider.
So these guys here are probably about 4 or 5 days old. You can just see the wing feathers starting to develop and the little feeders they've got there, and obviously, yes, you've got groups around under the lamps, but you're looking for chicks that are moving around between the feeders, the drinkers and the lamps and not all just huddled together for warmth. And these guys are very close. This is just before they went outside. So they're about 3.5 weeks at this point. You can see they've got much more feather coverage, although not completely. And yeah, these guys were just about to go outside. So that's about 4 weeks with these ones. Okay. So once we get to a stage where the birds are feathered, we're obviously then looking at wanting to move them outside. This is the nice bit, being able to move them into the sunshine, onto grass. All of our equipment outdoors, apart from the electric fencing, is homemade on site. I can't take any credit for that. That's Dave's department for sure. And the way that we have things set up is we have a kind of larger enclosure, which is using the electric fence you can see here. And that's to keep, not just to keep the chickens into their kind of place, but to keep predators out. And our main predators, mink, otters on occasion, and also eagles. We do actually have eagles that kind of fly up and down the lock there. So we have to consider the width of the enclosures so that it's not adequate width for an eagle to be able to land and take off again. So those enclosures are around 5 by 20 meters, but we do kind of increase the size a little bit as the birds grow, and we might have then 2 shelters, but whilst they're small, we're keeping them all together under one shelter. Avian flu obviously is a bit of a concern at the moment, but biosecurity in general, there's an increased risk when the birds are outside. And avian flu is a concern, and certainly in England, there's chickens are being locked down and so on. At the moment, that's not the case in Scotland, but we're obviously keeping a keen eye on what's happening there. So we move the shelters every day. We favour a shelter that isn't kind of enclosed at the base so that the chickens can move in and out freely within the enclosure, which means we don't have to move the shelters as frequently. Some of the shelters, like the Sailean shelters, possibly we would need to move more frequently. So that kind of cuts down on labour. And because we've got this design with the wheels that we've salvaged from bicycles, it means we can move, a person can move the shelter on their own. Or certainly I can move a shelter on my own. The sides, we've set them so they can be up or down, so we can kind of support the chicks depending on weather conditions, prevailing wind, if it's really sunny and they need extra shade, that kind of thing. And we do tend to put the sides down at night unless it's really warm. Doesn't happen very often on this moor that we leave the sides up overnight. And we do peg down, you can see that it's kind of staked out at the corners. That's just to stop it blowing away on when we have a slightly breezy day. What else have we got? Okay, so you can see here these chicks have only recently moved outside, so they tend to stay quite close to the shelter to begin with. So we keep the feed troughs close to the shelter as well. By this time, they've moved on to growers' pellets, and we just use drain pipes cut in half with little wooden feet to keep them stable and upright. And by this stage, we're feeding initially 4 times a day. Again, it gives us a chance to observe frequently. And by this point, of course, the chickens have got the opportunity to forage and, you know, supplement their diet with whatever else they can find in the grass. And here they are doing just that. It's lovely seeing them appearing from out of the long grass. And yeah, the occasional extra treat like a frog. So this is one of the drinkers that we use, again, homemade.
With the electric netting, we've tried both the 50-meter lengths and the 25-meter lengths. And unless you've got hands like absolute shovels, the 50-meter lengths are just hard work. Much better off with kind of multiple short fences. Makes it a lot quicker and a lot easier.
And we're still measuring out the feed at this point. You know, we will adjust. We keep records. We look at what we fed at the same stage in previous years, but we're also looking at what's happening on the ground. Are they clearing the troughs? Are they leaving a lot? Do we need to adjust? And weather conditions will influence how much they're eating as well. So that's all is part of our record keeping. Obviously, the cost of feed increases for feeding birds outdoors, and because it's taking longer to get them to target weight. The other challenge we've got living on a small island is that we can't get feed in bulk. So we're kind of restricted to the bagged feed, 20, 25, depending on the 20 kilos. And if we were to get that brought over, shipped over, that's quite costly addition to the cost of the feed as well. So we do go over to the mainland and collect the feed, but there's still an additional cost involved in that because we've got ferry fares and travel costs in there as well. So that does influence our bottom line differently to perhaps if we were on the mainland. Another thing for you to consider for your own context is that the birds are moving around more, they're eating more, and they take longer to get to target weight because they're growing more slowly. But also the conformation of the birds is completely different to what you'd get with a much faster grown chicken. Muscle fibers have been exercised, the tendons are much stronger. So just again, you might choose to go down a different route and go for a speedier development, but that's just kind of what we're finding. Okay, one of the things that we are at pains to do in the brooder is teach the chickens or give them the opportunity to learn how to be chickens. So one of the things we do in the brooder is provide them with small perches, so they learn how to perch, and they're much more likely to do that once they move outside if they've learned it very young. And you can see here, even during the daytime, so all our shelters have got perches inside as well. The chickens feel safer, they stay warmer, they keep cleaner. They're less stressed by being able to perch at night. And as you can see, the lights are perch in the daytime as well, just sit in the shade out of the sunshine. I think these guys are doing their job of kind of scratching through a cowpat and finding the bugs and the larvae in the cowpat.
Cool. So once that's all kind of happened, on the processing side of it, we're very lucky to have a nicely set up kind of processing and slaughtering area. It is the most expensive part of the process. The equipment involved is not cheap if you go down the lines of buying new. There are lots of second-hand options out there. For the actual layout of the slaughtery, Richard Perkins has got some fantastic YouTube kind of clips out there. It's one of those bits where spend the time planning it will definitely pay dividends when you come to building and operating it. If you get the opportunity to go and look at different people's setups, I highly recommend that, because you will come back with lists of do's and don'ts from all of them. There is a lot of hoops to jump through to get the slaughtery signed off. And if you have all of those hoops and boxes ticked, it's a much smoother process from that point onwards. The actual operating of it, as Alison was saying, we normally do kind of 70 to 80 birds in a 5-hour kind of shift, and that's from taking them from field, dispatching, evisceration, into the blast chiller. And we tend to do two days worth, and then the third day will be bagging and labeling, and then from that point they then move on to the deep freeze. We're aiming for approximately 20 to 30% difference between dead weight and live weight, and our current target weight is kind of 2.2 kilos per bird dead weight. We are finding, from a sales point of view, the smaller birds are relatively popular. The much larger birds, so the kind of 2.4 to 2.8, go well during your holiday season. So when people tend to have kind of groups around, but you do generally find that you will end up with a spectrum of weights within a single batch. So no matter how long you keep them, there are always ones that are much larger, and there are always ones that are much smaller. But we do find that that works out absolutely fine. Now we, as well as taking the whole carcass of the bird, we kind of use as much of the rest of the bird as we can. So the feet go for dog snacks, the gizzards get used the same, the hearts get packaged up separately, the liver gets packaged up separately as well, which actually, by the time you've done kind of 350 birds, you end up with a reasonable volume, which then becomes somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% of the overall kind of financial output as well from the batch. We've gone down the lines of using shrink bags rather than vacuum packing, and that's so we can reuse an existing piece of equipment, which is the scolder, rather than having to spend hundreds stroke thousands of pounds on a vacuum unit. Yeah.
Okay, so getting the product to market, I mean, that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, because that's going to be very unique to everybody's different context. For us, you know, our population is so small, and even with the increase of kind of regular or summer visitors, the population's not sufficient to sustain a viable chicken enterprise. So we tend to, our biggest customer market is actually on the mainland. So with kind of monthly emails, not too salesy, but monthly pestering from me, and fairly regular Facebook posts on the various local kind of community pages. People order via our online shop, and they can either come and collect from us, or for a small fee, I'll hop into my little van on the mainland, and we do home deliveries within a kind of 20-mile radius. As I say, we charge delivery up to a certain point as well, but that's going to be unique to everybody. We found it, we couldn't access very easily things like foodie events like farmers markets and so on. Just the practicalities of getting there and getting back with ferry constraints and so on. That's not proved something that was easy for us to do.
Yeah, so integrating the chickens into the kind of the rest of the grazing kind of area. So where the cattle are here down by the bay is very, very lumpy. It's relatively wet, but it's also one of our key areas for the marsh fritillary butterflies. So for us, we wouldn't wish to be taking the chickens into this specific area. So the fact that geographically it's hard could have worked in your favor as well. Now we're very lucky to have very diverse kind of pasture, both as far as kind of flora and fauna, which kind of means that we end up having to be relatively forward planning for where all of the different kind of enterprises are going to be running and the impacts that we wish them to have on the land. So we can't put the chickens onto the grass if it's too long. We ideally want them to be following the herd kind of anywhere between 5 and kind of 10 days, depending on the weather and the species of bugs that you've got going on in your cow pats, etc. But we can't do that because of our geography. So whenever possible, we do. So some areas it works absolutely fine, and the stock can kind of coexist. But for lots of the areas, that just doesn't work for us. So kind of managing your grazing plan to get it to that kind of optimal point for the birds, but without shortening your rest periods for the cattle. So we're working on a 60, 90 or 120 day rest period on the different areas, depending on the area itself and the time of year and the speed of growth. So with some of the areas, we end up slightly shortening that because the chickens will go on and have an impact. For other areas, it kind of ties in nicely. Cool. So where the cattle are at the moment, we have found that if we put the chickens onto the longer grass like this, they absolutely love it. But a downside is the seed stalks. You can end up with kind of compacted crops. If you are putting the chickens onto the slightly longer, slightly older grass, definitely make sure they've got really good access to grit to help them deal with that on the crops. The impact that we see the chickens having on the grazing, we are noticing a slight decline in some of the species, particularly orchids and bits and pieces along those lines that don't necessarily thrive on the more fertile areas. But what the increase in fertility is enabling us to do is to manage all the areas in a much more individual way. So the flatter areas that we are putting the chickens onto, we're seeing between a 2 and 3-fold increase in forage that we're getting from those areas. And with that increase in volume, it means we can either exclude or reduce the time impact that we're having with the animals on other areas. So where these guys are all the way up here, the top of this was absolutely full of bluebells back in the spring. And it was lovely to have enough forage available lower down to be able to exclude all of that top area, let the bluebells go right the way through, drop seed without thinking, oh, I need to get the cattle up there because I need that grass. So what we're losing from a slight biodiversity point of view down the bottom is enabling us to more than compensate for that with other areas. We have a couple of bits where I would say the impact has been too high. So this bottom section down here, we ended up with the laying birds in that area for an extended period of time. And even 3 years on from that, the grass comes through so lush and so rich just there that if I have the animals with too much access to that, they do see a little bit of scouring, etc., kind of happening. So moving the birds frequently enough that you're spreading that kind of manure and input is quite important. When it's very, very wet, they will spend a lot of time underneath the shelters, which means that rather than all of that being spread over several hundred square meters, it's been spread over the kind of 15, 20 meters that are immediately under the shelter. So on those days, you either take the hit on that particular 20-meter patch, you're going to have slightly higher inputs than you would wish, or you go out and you move your shelf on those wet days.
Okay, so there are some things that you need to know the answers to before you begin thinking about a chicken enterprise, and it's going to be different for your location. So again, we only can talk about Scotland for ourselves. As we mentioned, currently the avian influenza is kind of a bit of an issue and a consideration, and certainly if we were to need to lock down birds, we would not be comfortable locking down that number of birds. So we probably wouldn't be running a chicken enterprise at that time. So it's finding out what are the current biosecurity and other regulations in your area. In Scotland, it's now a requirement that our flocks are registered, even if you've only got one chicken, it needs to be registered. That's a fairly straightforward process. It wasn't a painful process, but it is a requirement. You need to talk to environmental health or your equivalent. The processing facility itself needs to be registered and certified with environmental health, including hazard analysis and so on. And you also need to consider the requirements for dealing with the eviscerate and the feathers and basically the waste that comes from the process of turning the chickens into a meat product. For us, water has to be tested annually. We're on a private water supply, so that involves an additional cost, of course, as well. I think it increases the cost per bird of about £1 a bird at the moment, because we have to pay to have the water tested annually. You also need to think about when it comes to the actual dispatching of the birds. In the UK, the regulations are that the person doing that piece of work must have demonstrated knowledge of legislation and competence in the act. That's the welfare at time of killing. So somebody needs to have a license in order to be able to actually dispatch the birds on your property, on your site. Think about any legislation or requirements around storage facilities. And that's going to depend on how you choose to store. So we freeze our birds, as we've mentioned, and the freezing process actually kills Campylobacter. So that's not something we need to consider. But if we were storing chicken to then sell fresh as unfrozen, or if we were kind of breaking up the carcasses for breasts and so on, then there'd be a whole different set of regulations and assessment we'd need to go through. And of course, when it gets to kind of bagging and labeling, you need to be thinking about or find out about what are the requirements and regulations in your area. So, as we're bringing meat into the food chain, there needs to be a kind of trail of where that meat comes from, dates and all of that stuff. But again, you'd need to know all of that stuff before you got started, really.
It's way, way more fun to be building chicken shelters and building slaughteries and designing websites and playing with chicks and chickens than it is to get all the legislation stuff nailed. But you will not be able to put your product into the food chain without that. And you keep coming across stories of people that have put all the hard work in, have put the money in, and then gone to jump through the hoops, and someone comes along and says, well, that's not up to code, that doesn't meet the requirement, and it's a big setback. So definitely get in early on all of that stuff. And most of the people that you end up dealing with, if you approach them in a timely manner, are quite happy to help, and will be, you know, good kind of signposters to different sources of information. Also, generally things that we found: start small. Definitely do multiple small batches before you start the actual operation. And I would say a small batch is somewhere in the region of 50 birds. If you go much less than 50, from a behavioural and management point of view, probably too small. If you go much more than 50, each batch then starts to become quite expensive, bearing in mind that you won't be able to sell those 50 birds as meat. You have a fantastically well-stocked freezer yourself. But yeah, so yeah, start small, multiple batches, test out all your different breeds and varieties. Make it, don't buy it. There's virtually everything other than some of the slaughtery equipment. You will be able to be creative and save yourself lots and lots of money. But if you do have to buy it, buy the best you can afford, specifically things that, if it fails, such as your stunners, it means you've written that process off, and time-wise, you then run into lots of issues with your stock management. So key pieces of kit, definitely worth kind of spending the money on, and keep records of absolutely everything. Because as soon as you start to run the bigger numbers, just being able to forecast your feed requirements, time requirements, as soon as you start to see deviations from that, if you're keeping good records, you're more likely to be able to work out where that trend is going to take you, or what the cause of that kind of deviation from the trend has actually been. We found that particularly useful last year when we swapped the variety of bird. We found the actual feed requirements day to day, it was a very different kind of profile to the variety we were using before.
Okay, so if we've wet your whistle, if you're starting to think this might be something that you'd be interested in for your context, there are opportunities to come and learn about the process, particularly welfare at time of killing and the requirements in the legislation around that. We will be holding some training here at Sailean during the summer with a view to the assessment following in the autumn. So if you'd like to know more about that, or if you've got any other questions about chickens, really, the process, and, you know, pitfalls we've come across, or ideas that you've got, then send us an email. And this is probably the best one to get us at, which is mine. Just say it, Alison@saileanproject.co.uk. And I don't know whether there's an option for us to kind of, I don't know if you want to jot that down, but take note of the spelling, because there's lots of vowels in there. But yeah, so if you are interested in finding out more about the WATUP training, or just want to ask us any questions, get in touch. And I think that's us for now.
Oh, thank you so much, Alison and Dave. Yay, that was beautiful. Let's have you stop sharing your screen, and then we can we're going to have a little conversation, the three of us. That was super. And I'll put your email address in the email to everyone that registered so they can contact you about that training. And I'm going to go through the questions and we'll see how many can we get done in the next 10 or 15 minutes, just to give people an idea of how much longer we're going, and you can decide if you're staying or not. We will issue a recording of the whole thing, so if you need to leave, you can watch the recording later. First question is just somebody missed, what breed of broiler did you decide upon?
We last year used Hubbards.
Hubbards. And have you tried other ones?
And the Sassos were also nice breed, but we just couldn't get them last year. But the Hubbards are a fairly similar conformation of bird, but Sassos and Hubbards we've liked.
Great. Why did you choose to buy in chicks rather than incubating them yourselves?
Getting the number of birds all at the right time. So for a relatively small percentage price, we can buy 150 chicks and have them all on the same day, all with the same kind of roughly the same genetic backgrounds. Whereas if we were going to be raising them ourselves, obviously we need to gather 150 plus eggs and then be running the incubators, etc. So we incubate birds for the laying flock, but just from a time point of view and having it when you want it, yeah, the day olds works well for us.
And availability of breeding stock for the broilers is they're not as available as you'll find for laying hens. So you'd be much more restricted in access to good breeding stock as well.
Great, thank you. Do you buy in just males for a larger size when mature?
No, it works out roughly 50-50 on what comes through. Yeah, the males tend to produce that slightly larger bird, but as I was saying earlier, actually having a mix within your batch ticks lots of customers' boxes because not everyone wants the larger birds. Quite a few people just want that kind of 1.4 style bird.
And then a couple people have asked about how you incorporate it into your grazing plan. How do you calculate livestock units for these birds? Do you, like, how many birds would be equivalent to one cow, for example?
Okay, so we're not calculating the livestock impact on units like that. So we're not working out how much forage they're taking from the bit. Yeah, they're out on pasture, they eat lots of the grass, but feed wise, it's not going to save you a massive amount on the feed. It's an addition to their diet rather than being their sole diet. So from our point of view, we're looking at the impact that they're having on the land, and that's also what it's physically looking like surface wise. Are they doing lots of trampling? Is it getting quite wet? But also over the next year, 18 months, what of the chicken inputs, what's the effect that that's having on the regrowth, the biodiversity, the soil sampling within that site. So yeah, we're looking more area rather than animals.
Great. Do you know roughly what percentage of their diet they're taking from grass versus the grain?
I think it would be very variable on the weather conditions, because when the weather's not great, they don't move far from the shelter and they'll just move to the feeders and back. When the sun's out and it's a nice warm mild day, then they'd be moving further. So I'm not sure you could easily say that, but it's maybe 5-10%.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. If you cull any without removing feed, their crops are always packed full of grass. And when you look at the amount of grass that's left, so the kind of any questions slide, you can see that they were literally just about to be moved out from that one. So yeah, they do get through a fair amount.
I love that picture with the frog in the bird's mouth. That was really cool. Next question, how do you prevent wild birds from taking the feed?
Can't.
You don't.
Okay.
You can't, and that's one of your biosecurity kind of factors to take into account, without having a kind of closed, fully enclosed area. You're not going to stop them, and the smaller birds fly straight through the kind of electric netting, so you're looking at a very different setup. So yeah, it's one to be aware of.
But also, I think because we don't ad lib feed, because we bring feed out at certain points of the day, by that time the chickens are ready to eat.
Oh, yeah.
They'll come straight to the trough, so that it's not like it's out all day and just being visited all the time by the wild birds.
Yeah.
It's only if they're not finishing what they're being fed that is a massive issue. But...
Yeah, and at that point, if they haven't cleared it within kind of half an hour, 40 minutes, we would probably then pick that feed up rather than leave it out.
Can you age the carcasses in the feather before processing them to improve eating quality the way some people do with turkeys?
Interesting. I've not looked into that, not tried it. From a carcass quality point of view, I've never found the need for it with raising birds in this style. The carcass conformation is fantastic. Yeah, good muscle definition, fantastic cartilage growth. There's no comparison. So interesting question, but can't help there, I'm afraid.
And you already commented the flavor is so delicious, and yeah. Do you have any more to say about that and how that's creating a customer base for you?
Yeah, once you can get a chicken in front of someone and they can actually kind of try it, they don't want to go anywhere else for chicken because it is such a difference. So one example is, once we've cooked a chicken here, we boil the carcass up, do a soup, etc. Now you can take one of the carcasses, and because it's so well developed, once you've boiled that down, if you've got 3 liters of water in your pan there, at the end of it, you can tip it out like a jelly mold, and the entire thing is set. Whereas you do that with one of your supermarket chickens, you can have a small amount floating around on the top and 3 liters of water.
And I think customers come to us and continue to come to us for different reasons. For some, it's because they like the idea of, what we're doing for the landscape, and soil health and so on. For some, it's flavor and memory. We actually had one customer who thought there was something wrong with the chicken. She thought it had gone off because she'd never tasted how chicken is supposed to taste. But she's now a very regular customer. She comes back frequently. Some customers come back to us just because from an ethical point of view, some from a flavor point of view, some from a health point of view. And so, it's ticking all of those boxes, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no denying that our chicken is a lot more expensive than you buy in the supermarket.
Okay, next one is a question for Dave. Is the chicken tractor a Richard Perkins design? Is it one the Regenerative Agriculture book, or would you be willing to share your design?
But I think Richard kind of took the kind of Sailean pen kind of style and stuck the wheels on, and we've kind of taken that and added our own bits onto it as well. Make sure it fits through your narrowest gateway. Yeah. Is the kind of, when you're building it, don't fall foul of that one.
Okay, great. And then the person that asked about the aging in the feather says, I asked about aging because of the extra work the muscles are doing. Would it tenderize it slightly? Might it be worth an experiment?
Everything's always worth an experiment.
I would think the opposite is happening with the muscle. Also used to flavor anyway.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Alison? Say that again. I missed it.
So because of the extra muscle usage, I know it kind of influences the flavor and the density of the meat, doesn't it? But I don't think it affects how tender the meat is.
Okay.
An observation that I would put in would be, even though the birds are nice and active, they're still very young birds. You're still looking at a kind of 12-week-old bird. I know when we kind of cull the laying flock off, and they're obviously very active, same environment. Yeah, those birds being kind of 2.5, 3 years old, yeah, they're a bit more chewing involved.
But that it might be worth an experiment in answer to your question. So
Okay, and we've got one person here who can vouch for the quality and flavor personally, who's not working at the Sailean project.
I think that was Jill. Hello, Jill.
And then we've got two more questions. Does your housing enable you to shut the chickens in the housing at night? And do they have feed through the night in the dark hours?
So yeah, the kind of roll down sides kind of pull tight against the side. If they chose to get out, they could get out. So we're relying on the electric fence as the kind of predator barrier. We don't leave feed overnight. Yeah, during the growing season up here, it tends to be light at kind of 5, half 5 in the morning, and can quite often be light until almost kind of 10:30 at night. So yeah, we don't give them feed during those dark hours.
Great. And then you mentioned having to jump through hoops with environmental health. Could you share some more examples?
Yeah, so actually getting the slaughtery signed off and registered, you won't be able to put anything into the food chain until that has all been signed off. Making sure that anyone that's kind of handling has got things like their food hygiene certificate, making sure that whoever's doing your culling has got their kind of WATOC licensing, making sure that you've kind of got sign off from your local environmental health officer for your storage, for your labeling, and for all your disposal of waste products. For us, the water certificate. Yeah, it's quite a long list, and will vary from your area.
But they are fantastically helpful. It never feels like it's an exam. It's they want, or certainly my experience working with environmental health has been that they want to help you get set up and be successful. They're not trying to prevent that. They just want it to be safe. So but yeah, again, different everywhere. So
our last question, how would you manage avian lockdown if it happened in the middle of your growing season?
If it happened in the middle of the growing season, we could bring the birds into the main shed here, but that would be kind of last resort. And if it happened kind of mid-season, we wouldn't do the planned batches for the rest of the year. So from us, from a kind of management welfare point of view, it's outdoor on pasture or it's not. Yeah, we've got a workable contingency for if it happens mid-batch.
If there's an existing batch, but we just wouldn't then continue with our future batches. Yeah.
That was so awesome, Alison and Dave. I really appreciate you spending that time, and that was so rich. And I would like to invite everyone to consider Holistic Management Training Comprehensive coming up in May. We will be hosted by Alison and Dave. They're phenomenal cooks, by the way, and we get to eat all their food that they've grown up there. It's a wonderful time, and you'll also get to meet Roger and Jilly, the people that Alison and Dave are working with there. And that's the 14th to the 23rd of May. And we also have low stress livestock handling with Miriam Parker, who's really an expert on this topic in the UK. That's happening on the 25th of March in Shropshire. And if you enjoyed this session, I invite you to come to our next Saturday session. Next Saturday, we'll be talking about what is EOV, or ecological outcome verification, and who is BART? And I invite you to attend that and learn more about how do you know if your land is in a regenerative state. And with that, thank you so much, Alison and Dave. That was fantastic.
For having us.
And thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.